Brazil, but it ranges extremely widely. So I'm extremely grateful to you, Professor Helgen, for coming to us today and joining us, and turn it over to you.
Of course, yeah. I'm gonna take off the mask. Okay, yeah, so let's see if I have my notes. Yes. So I'm going to be lecturing today on religion and slavery in the Americas. And as you can see from the subtitle here, we're going to be looking at how religion could form a basis of resistance to the slave system. We're also going to be talking about how enslaved Africans innovated and reinvented religious traditions in the Americas, and how that resistance and innovation was oftentimes met with horrific repression from authorities. Much of this lecture will focus on Latin America, partly because Latin American history is my specialty, as Dr. Gordon told you, but also because Latin America, including the Caribbean, accounted for about 90% of all trafficking of enslaved Africans throughout the Atlantic from 1500 to 1900. On this map here, it basically shows, so the width of the arrow indicates the number of enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to each country. And as you can see from the map, the two biggest recipients of trafficked enslaved Africans were Brazil and the Caribbean. Brazil itself, between 4 and 5 million Africans were brought to Brazil alone during this time period. And so one of the questions that we ask when we look at this map is, what is driving the high number of enslaved Africans being brought to the Caribbean and Brazil? What is one of the common factors that these regions have? In a word, sugar. So sugar cultivation requires an immense amount of backbreaking and dangerous labor. Sugarcane needed to be processed immediately after it was harvested, so sugar plantations essentially had to double as processing plants. And so enslaved Africans were working around the clock to press the cane. They press it in the mill over there, as you can see in this picture. This is from a plantation in Brazil, and then boil and refine the sugar in multiple stages, and that's what you see on the left here. And this was hard and, as I said, dangerous work. There were no safety precautions taken. Work didn't stop when enslaved people got hurt by the processing equipment. This was incredibly, dangerous equipment. And enslaved people who worked on sugar plantations thus tended to live short and, frankly, horrific lives. And societies that relied on sugar cultivation tended to have enslaved labor forces that were predominantly African-born. So then the question becomes, how does religion come into this picture? And in Latin America, officially, all enslaved people, in Iberian Latin America that is, were Catholic. They were baptized either before they left Africa or immediately upon arrival to Latin America. But most folks, if they were not born Catholic, like Congolese Catholics, for example, which I know you learned about Congolese Catholicism a few weeks ago, but if Africans were not Congolese Catholics, then they usually did not receive much Catholic religious instruction, in part because really the Catholic Church did not make much of an effort to give them religious instruction either before or after they left Africa. And so this left the religious lives of enslaved Africans mostly in the hands of their enslavers. And many Catholic plantations had a chapel on the plantation. So in this painting here, which is also of a Brazilian sugar plantation, you can see, you actually can't see my cursor, but on the right side, you can see a little chapel. You can see the tiny cross on top of the chapel there. And so a diocesan priest would come and say mass for the slave master's family and the enslaved people in that chapel. But there was an enormous priest shortage in Latin America, throughout all of Latin America. So many enslaved Africans, and indeed many white Latin Americans, did not have much contact with priests or with sacramental religious life. But all Latin Americans, white and black, enslaved and free, did have a vibrant religious lives in what are called confraternities, which are also called religious brotherhoods, which are lay religious organizations centered around a saint or a Marian or Christological devotion, and which historically they started out as a kind of mutual assistance society where members could get help paying for funerals, for example, or when they were sick or needed a loan or something like that. But by the 18th century, they were really the centers of Catholic religious life in the Americas. They raised money to build their own chapels and churches that they essentially owned and directed. And perhaps more importantly, they organized the festivals for the feast days for their patron saint. The saint for which they were named, which then became also centers of both civic and religious life. So these are very, very important organizations in the Americas, and especially Latin America. And it wasn't long before enslaved Catholics organized their own religious brotherhoods. And they organized lots of different brotherhoods, some that had only enslaved people as members, some that had both enslaved and free people of color, some that were just for one African ethnicity, and some that crossed many different African ethnic lines. You can see here Our Lady of the Rosary became a popular brotherhood for enslaved Africans and free people of color. And this picture here is actually the church of the Rosary in Salvador, Bahia. This is also in Brazil. And as you can see, it's a really beautiful, imposing church. Actually, today it's one of the top tourist attractions in Salvador, and it's a national landmark in Brazil. So these brotherhoods could really provide enslaved Africans with leadership positions, prestige, power. They also provided them with community and identity and spiritual guidance. And enslaved Africans did learn about Catholicism through these brotherhoods, but they also incorporated African civil and religious culture into their Catholicism within the brotherhoods, and then that had a big impact on Catholicism throughout the Americas writ large. This is a painting of part of the festival of Our Lady of the Rosary, which is the Black Brotherhood that I was just talking about. And you can see that part of the festival and procession is a crowning of a king and queen. And many scholars argue that this was part of a recreation of both African political structures and also religious traditions that are now incorporated into the lives of Catholic brotherhoods, and then not just Black Catholic brotherhoods, but all Catholic brotherhoods throughout the Americas. And the way that the brotherhoods celebrated and venerated their saints incorporated African religious culture. And so we have contemporary pictures of celebrations of brotherhoods. Again, this is Our Lady of the Rosary in Brazil, and you have the playing of drums and other instruments central to African religious life. You have the wearing of African religious garments and headgear, but all under the banner of the Virgin. You know, we have the Virgin here, we have these banners of the brotherhood and the trappings of, you know, any religious brotherhood that you would find in Latin America. But I also want to note that in many cases, specific saints in Latin America became directly associated or specially associated with specific orishas. And orisha is an African deity, specifically a Yoruban deity. And so one example that we see here is Saint Barbara. So on the right picture, we have a picture of Saint Barbara, and she's associated with lightning. So in this painting, we see the lightning in the top right-hand corner. Her story is that she was put to death for her faith by her own father, who then afterwards was struck by lightning and died, and so that's why she's associated with lightning. And then on the left here, we see a painting of the Orisha Shango. And Shango is also associated with lightning. And so devotions to Saint Barbara in Latin America oftentimes, you know, started to take on elements of what you would traditionally see in devotions to Shango. And the question then becomes, you know, what is the relationship between the two religions being practiced here? Is the saint just a mask for the Orisha? Is it a way for Africans to secretly continue to practice African religion in Latin America? Or is this just a way to approach a Catholic saint in a new way? Is there a fusion of religious ideas and identities, and really the creation of something new here? And scholars have argued about this a lot. This is a big topic of historiography in Latin America, but the general consensus is, you know, sort of all of the above, all of these, you know, a mass, but also a new way to approach a Catholic saint, a fusion, the creation of this, new type of way to approach saints and approach Catholicism. And just like European Catholicism shifts and changes through the years, adapting different ideas and traditions from a variety of different people and cultures, so too does Catholicism among African communities in the Americas shift and change and adapt and innovate. And so really we can see enslaved Africans in the Americas as religious innovators, creating new religious traditions and imbuing old traditions with new meanings and new interpretations. And of course, here I've been using the term African religion, but of course African religion was incredibly diverse and variegated. Different ethnicities had different religious traditions. So even if we're talking about Orisha devotions, for example, two enslaved Africans from different ethnic regions would have different ways of worshiping and understanding Orishas. And so all religion that was developing in Latin America was new, was a creolization, if you will. And so this is a picture here of a candomblé ceremony in Brazil. Candomblé is just one type of Afro-Brazilian religion that is still present today in Brazil. And it's not a direct import of African religion. It's really a Brazilian religion. It has elements of religious traditions from different African ethnicities. It has Catholics. It has Catholic elements too. So this is really a Brazilian religion. And so, we're seeing, yes, Catholicism is having innovation, and then we're also seeing innovation in the way that African religions are practiced in the Americas as well. But of course, Orisha religions were not the only African religions that were present in Brazil. Islam is a big force in enslaved society in Latin America, especially in Brazil. And here's where I want to turn to kind of this sub-theme of the lecture, which is the relationship between religion and resistance, religion and rebellion against the slave system in the Americas. The forcible conversion of Africans in the Americas was, of course, fostered by this idea among slaveholders that Christianity and religion in general was a force of pacification, a force of stability that would strengthen the slave system rather than weaken it or challenge it. Catholics and Protestants alike found no incompatibility between slavery and Christianity, especially in Latin America. The Catholic Church owned enslaved people, religious orders ran plantations even throughout the Americas, and in the United States as well. So on the surface, in the eyes of white Christians, religion was not a source of rebellion in slave societies, or they didn't think that it should be. But in practice, it of course turned out that it could be just that. And that is where we get turning to this book, Slave Rebellion in Brazil. It's by João José Reis, who is a Brazilian historian, and it looks at a major uprising of enslaved Africans in Brazil in 1835. So we're slightly outside of the time period of this class, but it's important nonetheless because this was an uprising of primarily Muslim Africans. In Bahia, Brazil, hundreds of enslaved Africans and free people of color rose up and attempted to take the city of Salvador in 1835. And they were unsuccessful, but it was one of the biggest and most consequential slave uprisings in all of Brazilian's history. And in this book, one of Reis's central arguments is that religion, and in this case Islam, united enslaved Africans of different ethnicities and fostered leadership and loyalty and pride in their community and created some of the conditions necessary for organizing this slave rebellion. And one of the most important elements of Brazilian Islam that really set it apart from all other religions in Brazil was how important the written word was. And so the importance of the Quran, of memorizing Quranic verses and then writing those verses on paper, really that can't be overstated. And this was a big deal because it meant that Muslim Africans in the Americas would at least be semi-literate. They would know how to write at least parts of Quranic verses. And in 18th century Latin America, most white people, including slave masters, were themselves functionally illiterate and could not read and definitely could not write. And so for enslaved Africans to be writing in Arabic, this was an immense point of pride. It inspired respect and awe from other enslaved people, and it also played a really functional role in organizing the community and perhaps in organizing something as complex as a slave rebellion, in that slaves and free people of color could write each other notes and letters and thus communicate over longer distances and in secret. And that's one of the arguments that's being made in João José Reis's book. And the written word became so important that the words themselves, the physical words written on paper, came to be seen to have special spiritual powers that could protect a person from harm and ensure that God is on one side. And this is how religious amulets, as João José Reis called them in his book, emerged. Pieces of paper with Quranic verses would be included in pouches, perhaps filled with other spiritually significant materials and worn around a person's neck. And then these amulets became hugely popular, not just for Muslim Brazilians, but for many non-Muslim enslaved Africans and free people of color. And so, this is a move that's also showing a blending and borrowing that's not just happening between Orisha religion and Catholicism, but also between Orisha religion and Islam, and as we'll see in a little bit, Catholicism. This is a picture from João José Reis's book, and it's actually of some of the Quranic writings that were found amongst the rebels and were part of these amulets. And so these pouches and these prayers were often called orações fortes, strong prayers. And this is a picture of a prayer card for Frei Damião. And what this basically is it shows that orações fortes actually became very popular in Latin America and especially Brazil amongst Catholics. And so this is Frei Damião. He's a Capuchin friar, popular saint in the Brazilian Northeast. I came across this prayer card in my own research. It's from the 1930s. So you see how, long and strong this this influence could be. And so you have here all this text on the right basically says it's an origin story for a prayer. And it says that this prayer was found in Jerusalem, that a man who was imprisoned for crimes was tried. They tried to put him to death many times, but it didn't work because he had this prayer. So it says, whoever carries this prayer with them won't die suddenly, won't be hurt by their enemies, etc., etc. So it's a similar concept, right, of these amulets that we saw before. Carry this prayer with you. The words of this prayer, the very words of this prayer, written down on paper, will protect you. But while Islam is contributing to this blending of religious traditions, sorry, I went too far, it sees itself as being separate and as being evangelistic. Like Catholics, Brazilian African Muslims want other Africans to convert to Islam in Latin America and especially Brazil. And this too creates conditions that make resistance and rebellion possible, not only because Muslims increase their numbers, but also because the conversion process is one that builds solidarity, with converts needing to spend time learning about Islam, having teachers, mentors, learning the language, learning the prayer, and all of this process is one that strengthens the binds of community and creates a situation in which you can have especially cross-ethnic solidarity, right, which oftentimes was very difficult when you had Africans from many different regions and ethnicities all being brought together in a new place like Brazil. And Islam is not the only religious expression that had revolutionary potential. I know that from Dr. Gordon, you learned about the history of Congolese Catholicism in this class, so you know that many enslaved Africans were actually born and raised in a strong and vibrant African Catholic culture before they were enslaved. And historians have argued that Congolese Catholics actually played central roles in some of the biggest slave rebellions in the Americas. And it's actually argued that they may have been directly inspired by one of, the most heroic anti-imperial and anti-slavery crusader of all time, really, one could say, Kimpavita. And so for those unfamiliar with Kimpavita's story, she's born in 1684 in the Catholic Kingdom of Congo. And when she was 20 years old, she began having visions from God. She began calling herself, and others start calling her a prophet. And she starts preaching throughout the Kingdom of Congo. And what does she preach? She preaches a really stridently anti-imperialist and anti-slavery message. She says that the Portuguese are only interested in enslaving Congolese Catholics, that they're not interested in their spiritual lives. And she basically says that European Catholicism is inauthentic, that true Catholicism is Congolese Catholicism. She says that Jesus, Mary, and even St. Francis were not only Black, but they were Congolese, and that her mission was to unite Catholicism, and specifically to unite Congolese Catholics under a single ruler. And at the time, the Kingdom of Congo was embroiled in these long-standing civil wars. And she wanted peace to be made under this banner of Congolese Catholicism, and thus uniting Catholic Congo, and especially maybe uniting them against the Portuguese. And she gains this huge following. Her followers are called the Antonians, and because she is said to be the reincarnation of Saint Anthony becomes very important here. And she and her followers are actually able to take over the capital of the Kingdom of Congo. But in the end, the movement is ultimately unsuccessful, and Kimpavita is actually burned at the stake in 1706. But she has this legacy that lives on, this legacy of religious resistance to imperial systems of oppression. And historians actually have been arguing that her memory fuels, in part, some very specific slave rebellions in the Americas, and they point specifically to the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, in the United States, and even to a certain extent, the Haitian Revolution. Now, the evidence for Kimpavita's influence in the aforementioned rebellions is admittedly pretty sparse, but it's not so far-fetched to think that such an important woman would remain influential, for decades after her death. And, many viewed her death as a martyrdom. And so here is what we do know. We do know that on September 9th, 1739, 60 enslaved Africans rose up and killed 23 slave owners in an attempt to gain freedom and actually reach Catholic Florida so that they would be free. And this event would later become known as the Stono Rebellion. And we know that many of the rebels, maybe most of the rebels, were almost certainly Congolese Catholics. We know that the rebellion occurred the day after the feast day of the Nativity. We think that the rebellion was planned on the feast day of the Nativity, which was a feast that honored the Virgin Mary. And this honoring was also common in the movement of Kimpavita. We also know that the word lukangu, which means freedom, was used over and over again in chants and songs and, narratives surrounding the rebellion. And historian Mark Smith has argued that this was connected to the word kanga, or salvation, as sort of millennial salvation, which was a big part of Quimpa Vita's movement. It was a big part of what's called the Salve Antoniana, which is a prayer that was at the heart of the Quimpa Vita movement. Now, this evidence, obviously, is quite slim. We have a word here, we have a date there, but given the general lack of evidence regarding the motivation of the members of the Stono Rebellion, and given what we know of the importance of Quimpa Vita and her movement, especially amongst Congolese Catholics, it's not too difficult to imagine that her legacy of resistance and anti-slavery would live on for years to come, and that Congolese Catholics who were subsequently enslaved in the United States would draw on her memory in order to organize the largest slave uprising in the United States. Now, these theories are relatively new, but you can find them laid out here in this really interesting article in JSTOR Daily by Mohamed El Naim, which lays out all of this, kind of evidence that I've put forth here in greater detail, and then links to all the academic articles where he's drawing sort of all these different pieces of the puzzle that he's putting together to show us that, yes, actually, Quimpa Vita and Congolese Catholicism was important in slave rebellions in the Americas. And Mohamed El Naim also argues that Quimpa Vita's legacy lasted until the end of the 18th century, at least, when the biggest and the only successful slave revolution to ever take place in the Americas, the Haitian Revolution, occurred. And so we don't really have enough time to get into all of the Haitian Revolution today. It's also very much beyond the temporal scope of this class. We could do a whole course really just in and of itself, just on the Haitian Revolution and on religion in the Haitian Revolution. If you are interested, I might make a short plug for Religion 715, which is happening next semester in the spring, History of Modern Christianity, which actually begins day one, taking a deep dive into the Haitian Revolution. But Mohamed El Naim basically argues again that we're seeing a lot of these themes, and especially, words of Kunga, of salvation, of this idea that a Congolese Catholic ruler will unite all Africans in order to resist an imperial order. And it's really interesting. So we have that. And I want to leave time for questions, but I also want to quickly give an overview of essentially, okay, so we have these amazing organizations of slave uprisings and rebellions where religion seems to be a core part of what allows enslaved Africans to do this organizing. But when, all slave rebellions except for the Haitian Revolution ultimately failed. And so then you have a big period of repression and violence and suppression, not just of enslaved Africans and the leaders of these rebellions, but also of the religion of enslaved communities itself. So part of this suppression was suppressing African cultural expressions. So in Brazil, with the 1835 rebellion, it's suppressing any any hint that Islam might be being practiced. So Muslim Africans underwent severe repression, could, even though they had always practiced their religion in a relatively secret manner, it became much, much, much more difficult to practice Islam, not just in Brazil, because what would happen is when you have a slave rebellion, news goes out, and so, other places, other, big plantation societies hear news of this and think, oh, I too need to, suppress any evidence of Islam or Muslim enslaved Africans being present in my plantation or society. And so you have, big, long-standing waves of repression of Islam, and then also Orisha devotions, right? This idea that particularly in rebellions like the Haitian Revolution, where Orisha devotions tend to be thought of as having an organizing role, you then have suppression of Orisha devotions, and really anything that's an African cultural expression. So in Latin America, you oftentimes, see the passage of laws banning drums, any sort of drums, from being played throughout the Americas, because the idea is that these drums are part of African cultural religious expressions that could be used to unite people in a rebellion against the slave system. Limit religious meetings writ large, right? And so you also see this idea, especially after big rebellions, that any religious meeting, even if it is said to be Christian, even if it is, under the watchful eye of a priest, or a pastor, that these meetings would be limited. In Latin America, religious brotherhoods, which again, as I said, were lay-led and really kind of independent from the Catholic Church, would oftentimes experience repression, but not full repression. So, religious brotherhoods in Latin America oftentimes really became one of the only ways for enslaved Africans and free people of color to practice their religion, right? Because this was the sanctioned space for religious meetings when other spaces had been suppressed. And then oftentimes after, especially what we see with the 1835 Muslim uprising in Bahia, you have deportation campaigns of free people of color, and particularly free people of color who were seen as religious leaders. So, you do see, the white slave system wanting to rid the Americas of some of its most potentially revolutionary individuals who they saw as religious leaders. So you have that. And with that, I really did want to leave at least 10 minutes for questions and discussion if you have them. Africans.
Can I just ask, do we see in Brazil, because you talked about Brazil, do we see the clergy becoming more mixed, or does it remain European?
It remains mostly European. You have, especially within the Catholic Church, there's a real resistance to ordaining either African or indigenous, really any non-white clergy throughout most of the colonial period.
I'm assuming some of the Congolese Catholics that came over were themselves already ordained.
Sorry?
Recognized? So I'm assuming some of the Congolese Catholics that were enslaved were already ordained. Was that recognized or no?
No. For sure. Yeah, that's also where we see a lot of the most interesting religious innovation, right? Because this is where, maroon communities are also spaces in which Africans of different ethnicities with different religious traditions are coming together. And, depending on the place, right, in Latin America, you tend to get a more Catholic-looking religious tradition. In the British Caribbean, the religion looks different. But yeah, I mean, these are spaces, again, when we're thinking of spaces of religious innovation, maroon communities are some of the biggest innovators, and oftentimes have some of the biggest impacts on especially regional religious life. So in Brazil, places where you had maroon communities oftentimes have some of the most interesting, scholars tend to put it all just under popular Catholicism, but you have some of the most vibrant popular Catholic traditions that essentially have been influenced by a lot of the religious innovation coming out of these communities.
Some of those maroon communities remain largely Catholic or retain Catholic practices?
Yeah, yeah. And again, I mean, it's what people oftentimes call popular Catholicism. I mean, we tend to think of Catholicism as a very clerical religion, right? You need the sacraments, so, when you think of a community that's largely cut off from Catholic priests, there are some Catholic religious orders that do, sort of itinerant missions to certain communities, but generally you have communities cut off from official sacramental celebration. But of course, and really Latin America itself is a place in which Catholicism really has a very important lay character that, yes, it is sacramental, but really it's a lot about devotions and practices and celebrations and festivals that are outside of the traditional church structures, oftentimes. Oftentimes they then become incorporated into the church structures, and we think of them as, oh, that's a festival that's associated very closely with this church or with this religious order. But oftentimes they started outside of that, and that's also what we see with Catholicism amongst Black communities in the Americas.
Do you think, did Campavita truly believe that Jesus, Mary, etc. were Black and Congolese, or was this a rhetorical move to help empower?
That's the thing. I don't think we can necessarily know, her interior motivations. Professor Thornton has a. Did I include that? I guess not. Let me try to turn my computer back on. In this article, Mohammed El Naim, and I can do I can maybe have Dr. Gordon put a link on your Canvas site or something like that. This article is nice because it links to all the different articles and books about Campavita and then connections to different slave rebellions and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, it's an open question, right? Of, excuse me, when you have particularly a religious leader who is also becoming a political leader, what is faith, what is religious belief, what is political expediency? Those become questions that become a little bit more difficult for historians to suss out.
What sources do we have for what she did say?
She did have writings. I actually am less certain of the primary sources. I've only ever read secondary sources about her life. But I mean, there is, you know, Thornton wrote a big book about it. It's, you know, I think there's enough to understand how important she was. I don't know if we have a kind of a, you know, writing beyond perhaps the trial that led to her being burnt at the stake and things like that.
Can you talk more about the syncretic practices of Catholicism in the Congo before slavery becomes more virulent in Congo?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in terms of specific syncretic practices, I'm less familiar with them. But, you know, Congolese Catholicism definitely was a Catholicism that already was, you know, in dialogue with, accommodating, appropriating African religious practices that predated Catholicism, right? And also Orisha religion that was still important. And so, you know, some of what, excuse me, some of what you're seeing in Brazil, or in Latin America, these processes would have already been happening in Africa. Just a slightly different, obviously, context in which you have Congolese Catholics with more agency to say, hey, you know, this is the type of Catholicism that we want to promote. Whereas in the Americas, because of enslavement and anti-Black racism, you don't have the same possibilities and agency to say, hey, we want to create a religion like this. You have creativity, you have innovation, but you don't have the same amount of agency.
What are some of the ways that oppressed people throughout this period made theological sense of their oppressors and their oppressors' uses of the religions that they found themselves holding dear? Like, how did that fit into the theological framework?
Yeah, I mean, so in Latin America, we don't have a very good idea of how enslaved people theologically understood either their oppressors or even, you know, we know a lot about the innovations that were occurring. We don't have a lot of writings of enslaved people themselves. There is not a tradition in Latin America necessarily like we have in the United States of accounts and diaries and those types of things. So we don't have as much access to the theology. But we do know that essentially, you know, religion and the Catholic Church could be seen as, you know, avenues for, technically the Catholic Church said we are all equal under the eyes of God, right? And especially in the context of religious brotherhoods, confraternities, right? We have the same amount of, we have the same right as all Catholics to create confraternities, to, practice our faith within the confraternities, So in that sense, you have this idea that Catholicism is for all of us. We have the same right to not just innovate, but also we have the ability to be good Catholics and even better Catholics than white brotherhoods, right? So, another thing with brotherhoods is you have competition, you have, the promotion of your brotherhood is also the promotion of your way of being Catholic. So you do have this idea that we as enslaved Africans have our own way of being Catholic, and it is, just as valid, if not more, You know, we can be more pious. We can, you know, we can have a bigger procession. We can, you know, do all of these things in a way that is not only just as good as, but maybe even better than white brotherhoods.